Hello everyone, welcome. Those of you in person, those of you joining us online on the PCG Studio page, which is streamed via YouTube and is archivable. A welcome here tonight for the launch of Brad Gooch's Radiant, The Life and Line of Keith Haring, published by Harper Collins this year. He'll be in conversation with Jonathan Burnam. Brad Gooch is a poet, novelist, and biographer. His previous 10 books include Flannery, A Life of Flannery O'Connor, which was a National Book Critics Circle Award finalist, a New York Times Notable Book of the Year, and a New York Times bestseller. A City Poet, The Life and Times of Frank O'Hara, God Talk, Travels in Spiritual America, and the memoir Smash Cut. He is a recipient of National Endowment for the Humanities and Guggenheim Fellowships and lives in New York City. Jonathan Burnam is president and publisher of the Harper division at Harper Collins, overseeing imprints which include Harper, Harper Paperbacks, Harper Perennial, Harper Business, Broadside Books, and Echo. He joined the company in 2005 as senior vice president and publisher of Harper. Prior to coming to the U.S., Jonathan was publishing director of the Chatto and Windus imprint and Random House in London. All of those books I listed are for sale, along with a few Keith Haring monographs. Welcome and thank you.
Hi everybody. Thanks to 192 for hosting this conversation. I was asked to begin by giving a brief overview of the book, and I realized that explaining to this particular crowd who Keith Haring is seems rather holistic. I think everybody in this room knows about the subject of the book, but in fairness, I would like to pay homage to the book itself, which was a labor of what, 6 years, Brad?
Or 7, depends how you count.
And entailed an enormous amount of research. Brad interviewed over 200 people. He was given access to the Haring Foundation archives. I don't know if you read every single word of Keith Haring's diaries. But
well, there are more. I mean, because there's published, and then there are the unpublished and the inscrutable. But but basically, I did.
And the result is a wonderfully comprehensive biography of a hugely important figure in the 20th century culture. And like all great biographies, it's other things besides. It's an incredible portrait of New York City at a kind of wild and fascinating time in the 1980s, when the city was going through a period of sort of urban decay as well as regeneration. But there was also a great spurt of creative energy running through it. It's also an important episode in gay history. Haring's story spans a particular period of gay life in New York. But it's also an incredibly entertaining read. It's a page turner, which is not the usual thing with serious long biographies. And I think it's telling that Brad writes at the very end. I just saw this the other day. That you thought about writing this as a novel in the first place, and in certain ways, this book does read like a novel. So, thank you, Brad, for writing this incredible book.
Thank you for saying all of that.
But let's go back to the very beginning, of that 7-year period. And when did that spark, the Haring spark, sort of light itself?
Well, I mean, you remember we had brunch at the Odeon, and that's when I suggested that to you. So there was that spark, but the beginning of it went a few decades prior to that. I mean, I said the other day, I'd sort of Forrest Gumped my way into this book because I was living in New York in the same period that Keith was here, and he arrives in 1978. He lives in the East Village. During a lot of that time, I'm living at Bleecker and Bowery, and so we shared those kinds of dark streets and dim lighting and patina of grime everywhere, but also share the excitement of all these posters advertising rock concerts or talking head at CBGB's, and political messaging like Jenny Holzer's Truisms. Basquiat and Aldiaz were doing their SAMO collaborations at that time, so anonymously basically you would see these crowns and cars and enigmatic lines of poetry, and sort of most importantly the subways. 1978 was a peak year of wild style graffiti with this big bubble lettering and this kind of acid TV color to everything. Keith Haring, instead of riding the subways, would go and sit in the station and then watch the trains going through, like a museum show. And so he was trying to figure out how to get into the chat in some way, the conversation. He'd come to New York, age 20, to go to art school of visual arts, and during those couple of years is when he's experimenting and trying to figure out his line and his signature, basically. I started to intersect with works of his. The first was my lover, Howard Brookner, and I were walking from the West Village to the East Village. One night I'd been living in the West Village, we were moving to Bleecker and Bowery. And stamped on the sidewalks in this graphite, and a pigment were these signs that said, "Clones Go Home," by this fake organization Keith started called Fags Against Facial Hair. This is an inside gay joke that everyone in the West Village supposedly had beards and leather jackets, and everyone in East Village were art students and hip. Howard helpfully said, "You better go home." So I remember that. Then I'd start to see barking dogs, crawling babies, particularly on a newsstand in Soho, and then certainly Keith begins drawing in chalk in the subways, and this becomes a massive sort of 5-year project. I also crossed paths a little personally with him. He supposedly came to a book party Dennis Cooper and I gave for ourselves at Limelight. I remember being at the reopening of the Apollo, and there was a row in the orchestra that right as the lights were going down filled with Keith and his kind of fabulous posse of mainly black and Puerto Rican young men and women. So he was a scene maker in that time, and characteristically then when Howard was sick with AIDS towards the end of the decade, Keith gave money for his care. I remember him at Howard's funeral standing in the back looking kind of spooked because he was within a year of his own death from AIDS. So all of this together, when we got into the 90s, and actually hard to believe now, but a lot of those artists, especially Haring and Basquiat, faded for a bit. There was a sense that the party was over, and I was always trying to figure out a way to write about this time and these people, and Keith just seemed like such a fulcrum through whom you could tell the time, because he wasn't an artist who stayed in his studio, and he was very involved in creating community and public art. So this kind of stayed with me, going up and down for a while, and then when it came time that I actually could write this book and had time, then I thought that I don't really like novels about artists and famous creatives, and that also the kind of context for the story was gone a little bit. John Groen had a book that he put together when Keith was still alive. These fantastic quotations from all of Keith's friends and from Madonna and William Burroughs. But the problem is, I realized you could now, if you said Club 57 or Mud Club, you couldn't automatically believe that everyone would know what you were talking about. Even younger gay people didn't really know what it was like to live downtown during this period of AIDS in the later 90s, and also the facts of Keith Haring's Guinness Book of Records life with this comet of a career he had over just 10 years. Was so fantastic that I thought biography would be the way to go, but always, as you were talking about, I mean, that there can be something of the novel to biography, and to sort of keep that storytelling to it, and Keith lent himself to that because he was had so much propulsion, so much going forward, and so much energy that he told many life experiences within one decade.
So Brad, you've written 3 other biographers: Rumi, the Persian poet, Flannery O'Connor, and Frank O'Hara. Apart from the obvious, what would you say are threads connecting these subjects? Apart from that, and also the brevity of the life, too.
Well, not Rumi. It
Oh,
was
did you
the
live a long
69.
time? Oh, wow.
Didn't you read it? Yeah, I get it. I do get asked this question. I mean, to me, they all go together. And to me, I mean, once I said they were all saints' lives without thinking of it, and I think that's kind of accurate in a way. I mean, they're not saints as in moral, virtuous, well-behaved people, but saints like those medieval saint lives where they're kind of wild and are doing something that no one else is doing, and have leave some kind of mark. So all 4 of them had that.
So one of the biggest challenges I think for any biographer is deciding what to put in and what to leave out. And one of the besetting sins of biography writing, I think, is over inclusion. They often swell way beyond their natural bounds. I think you've done. I mean, here it's 500 pages, which is substantial for a short life, but it was a hugely productive life. So you had a lot to do justice to it. But I'm curious about that process of sifting through the massive material you had.
Right. I mean, Keith, there's so much was going on with Keith Haring all the time that is the question, I think, with this biography. And so there was one part where I decided to show the reader what it would be like to really tell a day in the life of Keith Haring. And it started out, he was in New York, he's smoking a joint, going to take the Concorde to Paris, and he's with his 2 friends. They get off, they go into Paris, he leaves his bags in La Louisiane. Then he has a meeting about doing a big piece in the Pompidou, but made for the Pompidou piece for a show that's coming up in 3 weeks. And then he goes to the pediatric hospital, Hôpital Necker, about doing this outside mural that's for several stories high, and having to explain to them that he never uses a drawing or a plan. So he has to convince them. Then goes back to the airport, goes to Germany, to a factory to check out the first version of a barking dog sculpture that they're making, and then comes back to Paris again. So that it's completely exhausting. But once I did that. But the thing is with Haring, there were many days like that. And if you had a book of them, everyone would be exhausted, and it would be much longer than this. So you do have to. I mean, I always just thought of it as following the pulse of the story in some way, and that Keith Haring be there somehow in every paragraph or every page, and that was my method.
And were there times when some of the facts as they turned up didn't quite fit into the storyline as you saw it? So you had to grapple with these contradictions that didn't align.
Yeah, I mean, the great thing in biography is the the truth testing, I guess, a little bit. So, I mean, lots of times the things that don't fit in then become kind of great challenges as to how you want to handle it. And one little one is that, Keith is a great activist, and he at 12 years old, he was at the first Earth Day on the campus of Kutztown University, and huge anti-Reagan person, all this stuff. But in the election of 1968, there was a thank you note to him from the Nixon campaign. So I had to sort of, and the part of it, what I realized, because he was in high school, and then he was actually interested in the graphics of these different campaigns, and so he was like an equal opportunity person, and that I think is what happened. But moments like that then make you have to stop and kind of explain about something. Bad behavior can be that way. I mean, Keith's relationships with his lovers, everyone being very young in their 20s and going through a kind of stress test moment in history, and drugs and all of this, but he wasn't always perfect, and he wasn't always mature, and so then you have to also do that. So so the outliers are actually interesting
because they open up new avenues of thought. And,
yeah, and they make people real. It's more like more realistic.
One other thing that struck me is that
or more complicated.
Yes. The other thing that struck me is that this is the one biography you've written where your own life almost completely overlaps the subject.
Mm-hmm.
So, unlike the others where you would have to recreate a certain period, New York in the 50s and 60s and so on, here you knew it very well.
Right.
And was that liberating, or was it confining? Was it some mixture of both?
No, it was much easier. And sort of there's a kind of confidence in having been to these places, right? And so there's a way that you can kind of fact check yourself a little with the way things looked, and to have known a lot of these people. There's a way you can kind of fact check yourself, and otherwise, then you rely more on other people, and you rely more on certain descriptions of things. So I think that I found that helpful.
You also have massive video material and photographs. Everything was recorded, right? I mean, not as much as it would be now, but
right.
Even then.
No, it's sort of a middle point, I think. So certainly Flannery O'Connor was sort of reclusive. There are these like 28 photographs, and then you discover 6 others you've never seen, and that's a good day. But with Haring, all of a sudden, there were lots of photographs, and then, he took 1,200 Polaroids. Everything was video at that point, was hot and new and interesting. So people he was videotaping, people were videotaping him. There were hours of videotape of the Party of Life or a New Year's Eve party that he gave. So this was all a lot more information than I was used to having, and also interviews. TV interviews with him, interviews in different languages. He spoke to John Gruen for 22 hours, telling the story of his own life. So there's all of this material, which seemed like a lot. It did make me wonder what happens to this generation. Everything is completely, it's like carpet bombingly documented. Do you need money when you so, question, right?
why he was, you've said elsewhere in other interviews, he was very bio-prepared. He was like, he was, as it were, compiling everything ready for Brad Gooch to come along one day and kind of look at it. I mean, he did a lot of work. He set up a foundation, he got a board of directors, he kept everything pretty carefully.
Right.
What was driving that? I mean, at a certain point he must have known that he was heading towards the end of his life, but before that he would have started.
Right. Well, he's just one of those people who seem to always have it. There's a fourth grade essay where he said, I want to, when I grow up, you know, what do you want to be when you grow up essay? When I grow up, I want to be an artist. I want to live in Paris. I will sell my paintings. I hope that it happens or something. That was the essay, right? Yeah. So there are many examples throughout where he had this confidence and sense of purpose and destiny and mission a little bit. So, and he also, and with that, as a character trait, coming from a Navy German, he had his father had been a Marine, was kind of Pennsylvania German family. So he was very meticulous and actually organized. The reason, Tony Shafrazi, who was his dealer, told me the first thing that interested him in Keith Haring, who had come over as an SVA student with a friend to paint the walls of Tony's gallery. Tony was very impressed because Keith would then clean all of his brushes, you know, and leave everything in this like very organized pattern. And he hadn't seen that kind of meticulous organization from someone. And he had that sort of all the way through. So he was always dating things, and he was keeping everything. And it was I think a combination of that methodical trait that he had. You can also see his mind at work when you're watching him, which is the greatest thing with Keith Haring, is watching videos of him drawing. Because then you start realizing the only way he would have to have the whole drawing in his mind when he started to be able to do what he does, because the way the lines come back in later, it takes a kind of planning. So all that went together. In terms of the future, I mean, he always said that he learned more from artist biography, reading artist biographies, than anything else. So he was very much someone who had biography in his mind. He then, when he gets to the end of his life, you know, one thing is commissions Julia Gruen, who was his assistant, her father, John Gruen, to go around and interview everybody, and Keith gets everyone to be interviewed. So he's very interested in that record, and then kind of amazingly, I mean, for a late 20s guy, he sets up this foundation. He sets up the 4 people for the board of directors, and then he says that half the foundation is going to be about giving money away to causes that were important to him, especially around youth and around AIDS, and that the foundation can't raise money; it has to come from the money they make from his work and things. So to set up that, like, the foundation has given away nearly $50 million since he died to these different causes. So to keep alive his work, and also this generosity is a real takes this kind of forethought that we're talking about.
As he was thinking about his own destiny, talk a bit about how Keith Haring responded to the kind of complicated critical reception he had during his life. I mean, it continues actually. It's an ongoing debate. You read about it, and you've actually been exposed to it to some degree in the reviews.
Yeah.
I think so.
Which amazes me.
Yeah.
So I wrote the big controversy in Keith's life was he started the Pop Shop on Lafayette Street. How many people have been to the Pop Shop? See, we're in New York, and so the debate that when he came under a lot of attack, and and it was mainly that he was now selling, I mean, that he brought together art and commerce in this way, and that was considered taboo. And it was going even beyond Warhol and Warhol's idea of business art. He was actually opening a store and he was selling what Jeffrey Deitch said was a new genre, art merchandise. So at the time he was attacked, Robert Hughes was the leader at Time magazine of this, and he had been targeting Haring and Basquiat all along. I mean, he wrote about Keith Boring, Jean Michel Basket Case. He said that Keith was a disco decorator. There was a kind of homophobia going on in this, the same way with Basquiat, as Haring pointed out. It's kind of racism, like when Robert Hughes said he was the Eddie Murphy of art. So so he was facing this and this idea that he was a capitalist and he used to be, giving it away in the subways, and now he's charging, very little. The Pop Shop actually never made money. He was trying to get things at price points that people could buy. But that, at the time, hadn't really been done and was controversial. And he said at the time, what do they want me to do? Stay in the subways? Would that make me pure? But you're right. Reading a couple of these reviews, one I guess was Art News about whether Keith Haring was a sellout, and the other in the New Yorker about brilliant brand versus brilliant artist. And I was surprised by that. I mean, it seemed kind of Back to the Future to me, because when I was writing about that, to me I was writing about it seemed sort of quaint, and it was history in a way, and I thought that was interesting. But that it's still an issue, in some way has to do with the licensing of Haring's products, I think. And so that sort of, if you follow the logic of what he was doing in his life, you can get to this licensing of all his work. So that's how we get to see Keith Haring in our kids' sweatshirts and all of this, right? But since he's not here, it's always debatable about, has it gone too far? So I'm thinking that's why this is an issue at the moment, but I was surprised by it.
One of the things I was surprised by in the book, but also looking at some YouTube documentaries in preparation for this, was the fact that Haring sort of had very little irony in his engagement with the world. I mean, when he's talking to camera, he's absolutely earnest.
Right.
He's very straight. And I mean, you write about that, how that becomes more manifest in the political works that he does.
Mm-hmm.
But it's there throughout in that business.
Yeah, I mean, when I was talking about all these ways in which it was there from the beginning, I remember when I was reading then the journals from when he was 19 years old, hitchhiking with his girlfriend Susie. He had a girlfriend for 2 years in Pittsburgh, and they were selling Grateful Dead t-shirts going across the country. And he was reading Robert M. Rye's The Art Spirit. And he has this sort of, it's going on with a very romantic idea of how art can change the world and what he wants to do with his life. And it seemed to me, oh, that's so sweet and perfect. I mean, this is a teenager, and this is this pure connection he has to art at this point. Then I realized when he was 29, listening to interviews with him and then reading them, it was the same voice. I mean, he had the same sort of earnest, ambitious, confident, utopian plan, and a mission in terms of his activism around apartheid and around AIDS and gay liberation, and environmentalism. All of this was, as you said, was unironic and earnest, and set him apart in certain ways. I mean, he was very close to Andy Warhol. Warhol was obviously a huge influence and mentor in terms of pop art and business art, but they were very different artists because Warhol was always ironic, it seemed to me, and cool, about popular culture, and Keith of the next generation wasn't as, he was immersed in it. I mean, he was just enthusiastic. He was like a fanboy about things.
I think that also explains Haring's connection to children, who lack irony as well, in a way he could engage directly with them in a way that well, he understood them, they understood him.
Right. Now, the sort of most fascinating interviews to me were with the people who were children then, grown up now, and they had a point of view on him, which was the kid point of view that was interesting to hear. I mean, one of them was Sean Lennon, very close from age 9 with Keith, and he talked about that, because Andy Warhol, through his mother, they were all friends. Andy said he was jealous that Sean liked Keith better than he liked him, and so I was asking about this, and Sean said, well, he said the thing with Andy is he was very chic, like he would wear these jackets like we have, and you know, and Mr. Chow said, but I didn't know what chic was, and Keith looked more like a kind of middle school. You know, he had the sneakers and this kind of baggy look from the time, and also his work was completely accessible to kids. I mean, it was this cartoony kind of work, and even if the messaging could be dark, the entry into it was pretty clear. So talking to Nina Clementi, Francesca Clementi's daughter, there were so many stories in terms of leaving things out. So many stories from kids that would just seem whimsical if I piled them on. But you know, but she was telling me she was living in her father's studio and she was afraid of ghosts. And Keith comes over one day and on the walls does all these like friendly Haring ghosts with jumping rope and ghosts with cowboy hats and all this kind of thing. And she sort of gets over her ghost fear. So a lot of that, you know, it's a lot of that.
I think we have like another 10, 15 minutes, so maybe we should open up the
Sure.
floor to questions from anybody here. Anybody want to start? Yeah.
So did Keith Haring not appoint a biographer? Because he knew he was dying, and then I said a little follow-up, which is, what do you think he would give you read the book?
Well, he did appoint. I mean, John Gruen he appointed to do the biography, and then the you know, it was just the meet. So John interviewed these people, and Keith died, and then the medium that he chose or was chosen when the book came out was an Edie style kind of telling the story with block quotations, but it is definitely a biography. What he would do, I don't know. I don't know the answer to anything that has to do with after Keith's death. Like people ask me, what would Keith Haring do if he were alive now? I don't know. I mean, the easy answer is he's so made for this moment. I mean, he is social media. He was doing social media, so he would be the king of social media. Disney invited him to collaborate with them when he was still alive. On his deathbed, he got a letter inviting that collaboration. So all that makes sense. But you know, there's another thing where Keith talked also in those last few years about he didn't want to sell. He was thinking of not selling any work anymore and just doing work without selling. And you know, he could also have done something like that. I mean, the way his mind worked, it's hard to guess.
You thought that Disney was a joke, right? You thought it was do you think he was like a...
Well, he was really, I mean, this was in the last few days of his life. He gets a letter from the Disney company suggesting a collaboration with Haring's view of Mickey Mouse. Right? So this is, I mean, Haring had said the three great artists of the 20th century were Picasso, Warhol, and Walt Disney. So obviously this is a big deal for him. But at this point, he was really in and out of consciousness, and Julia Gruen read him the letter, and he was, you know, he was alert, but his reaction was, "You're making it up, right? You're just saying that to make me happy or keep me alive or something like that."
Anybody else?
Thank you for writing this biography for us. I'm
You're
curious
welcome.
about the dynamic between Sang-Kwang Chi and Keith Haring. He documented so much of Keith Haring's work, and yet there's so little written about that relationship. Do you have any comments regarding that?
Someone here would, but I won't do that. Yeah, I mean, I think the relationship, in terms of Keith planning for the future, which we were talking about, certainly Sang-Kwang Chi was an important part of this. So they, met in East Village, were part of Club 57, and when Keith starts drawing in the subways, and eventually does 5,000 drawings over 5 years on these black mat, the empty between ads being pasted up, so they're temporary and they're fragile. And then Kwang Chi took photographs of them. And when it started developing more, then Keith would call him up and say, "Oh, I went to 34th Street and 23rd, and I was on the R and the F," and then Kwang Chi would ride at the front of the train and get out and take pictures. So we have all this documentation. The only actual drawings that we have are ones that people started cutting out near the end, which is why Haring stopped, because then they tried to sell them. But actually, if they hadn't done that, we would have none of these drawings. But we do have all the photographs, and I just think that so it was a collaboration in some way, right, between the two of them, and I think it was understood that way. I mean, Kwang Chi had to, he had to adore Keith Haring in some way, right, to do all this work over that amount of time. But it seemed it was a loyal and enduring kind of friendship. So even one of the works Keith Haring did in the last year of his life, or the last 6 months, was this giant mural in Pisa on the side of the church, called Tudo Mundo, and Kwang Chi was with him for that trip. They both at that point Haring had capillary sarcoma spots and things, but they were riding around in a carriage and looking for murals they could base the work on and things. So it was a nice and very productive friendship that way.
There's somebody else. Yes.
You touched upon something recently on a podcast that was really fascinating, and that was you were at the recent Madonna show, and there's that moment where both your late partner and Keith appear in a giant video montage,
Right.
honoring people lost to AIDS, and that affected you. Can you speak about that?
Yeah, I don't know how many people were at the Madonna. That seems less than the pop shop. So there's a moment in this tour, and then I was at Madison Square Garden and I was talking. I mean, I knew it was going to happen. I heard about this, but it is kind of shocking. And this Madonna singing "Live to Tell," and then this huge banner comes down of Keith Haring, which is like right opposite me, and it's like 3 stories. And then this banner of Howard Brookner comes down next to it, like opposite me, and it was a lot for that moment. I mean, it was really shocking, even though I was prepared for it. And so we have to thank Madonna in a certain way. I mean, because she did. There is a kind of testament, I think, in that, which is important to do. And I think and I hope, my book is part of that because of writing about that period. But it seems that fellow travelers on TV, I mean, there is a moment of, it's definitely not nostalgic, but maybe reflection about that time. And, and probably the right amount of time has gone by So Ann Temkin, curator at MoMA, just going sideways a little bit, said to me she thought one thing about the interest in Haring now is that sometimes there's like a 30-year lapse before people get certain kinds of art. She felt that it happened with the Lilies and the Abex painters, and she said that Keith Haring is kind of at that 30-year mark. So you can look at his work in a different way, I think, and that period is now history.
Over here.
What
next?
I have no
Over
idea.
here,
What?
there's a question.
Hi, we'll get these,
Well, all right,
we'll
two
come to you
questions.
next.
All right.
Okay, so,
I'm going to answer the Peter next question, which is I don't know.
I'm curious.
You're gonna say
too.
Mark, do you have any ideas?
I would then ask, do you feel that you've said everything you have to say about this period in time? About which you've written as a journalist a great deal, and it's in biographies and in your own stories. Do you feel that you've exhausted the topic, or do you still have more for us? Because you make it fresh each time, so.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I would need, but rest is part of it. I think I have said enough about it. Yes.
So we all know about his friendship and interest in Basquiat and Warhol and just
Mhm.
the other artists that we hear about all the time. But did you discover any? Was he paying attention to like other artists, his contemporaries, and were there surprising artists to find that he was interested in or even communicating with?
Well, I mean, certainly with his contemporaries, definitely. I mean, because one of the, again, traits of Keith Haring is that he in the beginning curated shows, and he was very interested in setting up community. So he curated shows at Club 57 and then at the Mud Club, and these were all shows of his friends, basically, right? So and from art school. So Basquiat, but Kenny Sharp, David Wojnarowicz, and sort of other artists who've been forgotten, or shows of anonymous art, or shows of erotic art. And he did at the Mud Club. Then was involved in curating the show that was all graffiti artists at the time, and Days, Fab Five Fred, Hayes, Crash, those artists. So he was actually very alert to what was going on with his kind of generation. And it's interesting when he gets into, becomes a global art star, and these other kinds of artists begin to more show up in his work. And he had been very influenced by Alashinsky because of a show that he saw when he was in Pittsburgh, and then he actually meets Alashinsky at a certain point in Europe. You can see the effects of like him trying out Leger in his work, and Picasso and Frank Stella, and he just as his world becomes more the museum world and the globe, you see him sort of working through, painting on canvas and working through some more kind of contemporary painterly kinds of issues too.
Do you think he was ever interacting with like the picture generation or like movements that we don't really think of as being related to his own work?
Well, he was certainly really. I mean, he was doing collaborations like with Jenny Holzer in that way, and he was friendly with Julian Schnabel and with Ross Buckner. So the art world at that time was smaller, right, and in place in a way downtown. So there was that kind of interaction, I think.
Anybody else?
What about the title Radiant, like the subtitle, The Life and Line of Keith Haring is a great title in itself. But I wonder about Radiant, is it just about, in relation to what you were saying about all these people being saints, in other words, in their way, Is there any connection there, and when you said how when Keith Haring, when he was actually working, he had the whole picture in his mind, and I wonder if that it's not necessarily that there, you know, we think of being ecstatic as being high, but actually, the etymology is to step outside of yourself.
Mm.
And when he was painting, you know, I don't know if he had the whole image in mind, but he wasn't there. And so it got made without him, you know? Is that related to, or was Radiant just a marketing thing? You know?
Well, the cleverness of it would be that Rene Ricard wrote this essay, The Radiant Child, which was the essay that kind of broke Haring and Basquiat to the world, and so that name, I mean, he was associating with a group that included Francesco Clementi and things, but it was specifically also Haring, and the illustration was Haring's Radiant Baby pin. So and then there were, so between Radiant Baby, Radiant Child, there was that kind of reference in it, which I wanted to be there. But I also think it applies to the work. I mean, when you see, like now there's a show at there was a couple years ago at Tate Liverpool, and then there was a show at the Broad. Haring's paint is very fresh. There's something very fresh and recent in these works, right? So it applies to the work, and it applies. There was, which I quote in the beginning of the book, someone said the Radiant Baby was the first believable 20th century halo. So there is an aspect in which one of its meanings is that kind of purity, and also, I mean, not to overstate Haring, but his doctor told me remember during AIDS, doctors' lobbies were really crowded. I mean, it was like standing room only. And these doctors' offices, and Keith would come in, and he said, he would really he said, for lack of a better word, he was radiant. I mean, he would brighten up the room. He said it wasn't because he was a celebrity; it was because of the kind of energy that he had. So I think, so for me, the word was able to try to get all those dimensions.
Thank you. I never overlapped with him, so I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, you mentioned that when he was very young, he wanted to be a painter in Paris.
Mm-hmm.
Did he ever spend considerable time in Paris painting as?
Well, he spent yes, he did. I mean, he had, when he goes to, he sort of decamps to Europe a lot after the opening of the pop shop and all this controversy and things. So he would be there 6 months at a time. Yeah, I mean, not just Paris, but in Brussels and in Rome, etc. And especially towards the end of his life, he basically treats the Ritz as his apartment building. So when he goes to Paris, he stays at the Ritz. And Yoko Ono, who's at the spreading of the ashes, which was a service mostly for family in Kutztown, tells a story about how a voice came to her and told her to put the ash in her pocket, and that she did, and then it would tell her where to put it in the future, and then when she was in Paris, told her to put it in this fountain outside of the Ritz. So so that kind of thing. But he was working. He did big works in Paris, like the outside of the hospital. So he was there for that. He became very friendly with George Condo, who was living in Paris at the time. And Condo had also a very kind of painterly influence on Keith at that time. And hanging out with Tim Rosenquist and different artists who were in Paris. So he did.
Paris life.
Yeah, he had a Paris life. And was definitely a recognized artist in Paris and showing at the Complicated and the gallery. Yes.
One more. Let's say one more question. Anybody?
mentioned Madonna, and I know she was friends with him when they were younger. Did you try to interview her, or did you reach out?
Yes.
Did you interview her?
No. No, I definitely did. And you know, she and we were in communication. She was also friends with Howard and was also very sweet about that book. But you know, I think she has her own. She has her own story to tell. I think this is what that comes down to. But it was also helpful in these John Gruen tapes. There is a long interview with Madonna and the Madonna of that moment. So that was very helpful to me because sometimes it's by discovery, sadly. It's better better to read a printed interview that someone did 25 years ago than a live interview that they're doing now, since people have told the stories over and over or they've forgotten.
Well, thanks everybody for coming out. Thank you very much.